With John Thune, the South Dakota Senator, Senate Finance Committee. Overall, great read of things on Capitol Hill and the Capitol that's going up at the corner of Wall and Broad. There does seem to be a connection, Senator, to the election of Donald Trump and what's been happening since. Do you buy that?
Of course there is, Neil, and by the way, you're anything but boring.
Thank you.
But no, I think that there was some optimism and some hope that came out of the election, particularly with regard to business. You know, we've had now, if you look at the worst economic recovery in 60 years, we haven't had a single year in the current administration where the growth rate has exceeded 3%. You've got this huge, heavy burden of regulation that's making it more difficult and more expensive to create jobs in this country. And so I think the election came, and it's like people just felt like a huge sigh of relief. And I think that a lot of these things that are standing in the way of economic growth are going to be addressed. And I think that's why you see the activity in the market and
but are we
the
getting
kind
ahead
of trends being reflected there.
Senator, I'm sorry, sir, but are we getting ahead of ourselves? Not so much asking you to play a markets who's there here, but that everything's going to fall into place. Steve Mnuchin, who's going to be Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary, was on Fox Business earlier today. Again, said if you don't get it, you should demand. And the incoming Commerce Secretary, who hopes to be Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, they were talking about the various plans that are out there, in a 100-day rush to get cuts in regulations to deal with Obamacare, and also to cut all tax rates. I want you to react to what Steve Mnuchin had to say on that subject with Maria Bartiromo.
We're already sitting down and discussing this with Congress, and this is going to be something that happens absolutely within the first 90 days of this presidency. We're going to have a major tax reform, biggest tax reform since Reagan, and it's not just going to be a cut in corporate taxes, but it's also going to be a very large middle-income tax cut that's going to help this country.
Now, I know, Senator, you're also one who watches out for spending. You abhor deficits. You've not liked the piling on of the debt we've seen doubling under this president. At least short term, sir, it looks like we're going to dig into deeper deficits as we see. Hopefully, I'm sure the Trump people are arguing for a bang for the buck later on. But short term, I'm sure deficits could and likely will get worse, right?
Well, I mean, we have a deficit problem that needs to be addressed, and you address that in two ways, through fiscal restraint, through spending restraint, and through faster growth in the economy. And I think what tax reform is all about, and what the Trump team is starting to talk about, is how can we get the economy growing at a faster rate? How can we get growth back up to 3 to 4%? Because ultimately, as you know, Neil, when people are working, they're investing, they're paying taxes, and government revenues go up. And so the objective of tax reform should be economic growth. Now, we have my colleagues on the other side, a lot of the Democrats think that tax reform ought to be about expanding and growing the government, generating more revenue. We think it ought to be about growing the economy. The economy is growing and expanding. You're going to see the deficit situation improve dramatically. And that's why this tax reform discussion that's going on is so critically important.
But is it important to you, John Thune, coming right out the gate, to see those tax cuts and actually get all of that going, live with maybe deficits that might get a little worse in the short term before that dynamic accounting, whatever you want to call it, and the revenue you get from tax cuts, which is clear? Could you live with that?
You know, I would prefer that any tax reform that we do would be revenue neutral, would not impact the deficit. I think that's the objective and the goal. But remember, you're talking about a 10-year budget window. That's what we operate with. You're talking about a dynamic economy, and if you use macroeconomic or dynamic scoring, tax reform is going to change behavior out there. When behavior changes and you get more economic growth, you will see more revenue come in. So I think what we're going to be looking at is how these things play out, not only in the near term, but in the long term, with the ultimate goal in all this is to get that growth rate back up to where it should be and get our economy healthy again. When it's healthy again, people are going to be working, wages are going to go up, and obviously tax revenues go up with that.
Well put, Senator. Thank you. When you went into that macro thing, I thought you were trying to outdo me. You couldn't do that.
Nobody can do that.
No. John Thune, thank you very much. Great seeing you again.